and the kid who programmed a drone and saved the millionaire's life. Chapter 1: The Boy and His Wings. The autumn rain pelted against the window of Leo Martinez's cramped bedroom in Queens, New York, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the city skyline beyond. At 14, Leo had grown accustomed to watching the world through glass, whether it was his bedroom window, his computer screen, or the small display on his drone controller. The latter sat on his cluttered desk, surrounded by circuit boards, tangled wires, and programming manuals that most kids his age wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. "Leo, dinner!" His mother's voice echoed from downstairs, but he barely registered it. His fingers danced across the keyboard with the fluidity of a pianist, lines of code flowing across his monitor like digital poetry. He was deep in the zone, working on what he considered his masterpiece, a custom flight control system for his drone, which he'd affectionately named Icarus after the Greek myth his English teacher had assigned last month. The irony wasn't lost on him. While the original Icarus had flown too close to the sun and fallen, Leo's Icarus was going to soar higher and more precisely than any commercial drone on the market. The drone itself wasn't much to look at. A modified DJI Mini that he'd bought second-hand with money earned from fixing neighbors' computers. But under its unassuming exterior lay Leo's true genius. A neural network he'd been training for months to recognize and navigate complex urban environments. While his classmates at Roosevelt High were worrying about homecoming dates and football games, Leo was solving problems that graduate students in MIT's robotics lab would find challenging. "Icarus, run diagnostics," he whispered to the machine, even though it couldn't hear him yet. The voice commands were still in beta. His phone buzzed with a text from his only real friend, Marcus, asking if he wanted to hang out at the mall. Leo glanced at the message and set the phone aside. The digital world felt safer, more predictable than the chaotic social landscape of teenage life. Here, in his room, surrounded by the gentle hum of computers and the soft glow of LED strips he'd installed himself, he was in complete control. The local news droned on from his mother's television downstairs, a constant background noise about traffic accidents, political scandals, and weather updates. Leo had learned to tune it out years ago, finding more truth and beauty in the elegant logic of programming languages than in the messy, often cruel realities that dominated the headlines. His mother worried about his isolation, frequently suggesting he join school clubs or sports teams, but she didn't understand that Leo had found his tribe in online forums and coding communities where intelligence mattered more than social status or athletic ability. As he fine-tuned Icarus's obstacle avoidance algorithms, Leo felt a familiar sense of purpose wash over him. This wasn't just a hobby or a way to pass time. It was his calling, his contribution to a world that often felt like it had no place for quiet, awkward kids who preferred machines to people. The drone represented freedom in its purest form, the ability to transcend physical limitations and explore spaces that human bodies couldn't reach. Through Icarus's camera, Leo had seen sunsets from impossible angles, navigated through abandoned buildings, and captured aerial footage of his neighborhood that revealed patterns and beauty invisible from ground level. The rain intensified, creating a rhythmic percussion against the glass that matched the tempo of his typing. Somewhere across the city, in a world of glass towers and corporate boardrooms that felt as distant as another planet, the machinery of wealth and power continued its relentless grinding. Leo didn't know it yet, but those two worlds, his small bedroom kingdom and the gleaming fortress of Manhattan's elite, were about to collide in a way that would forever change both their trajectories. For now, though, he was content to lose himself in the familiar comfort of code, unaware that his greatest test was approaching with the speed of flame and the inevitability of destiny. Chapter 2: The Man in the Tower. 23 floors above the bustling streets of Manhattan, Alistair Blackwood stood motionless at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city below through eyes that had long since lost their capacity for wonder. At 58, he had everything the American dream promised: a business empire worth $3 billion, properties on 3 continents, and influence that reached into the highest corridors of power. Yet, as he gazed down at the ant-like figures scurrying along Fifth Avenue, he felt nothing but the familiar weight of isolation that had become his constant companion. The office around him was a monument to success, all polished marble and brushed steel, with awards and accolades lining walls that seemed to stretch into infinity. His assistant had left hours ago, along with the rest of his executive team, but Alistair remained, as he did most nights, working through reports and projections that would determine the fate of thousands of employees and millions of dollars. The numbers on his screen blurred together: profit margins, quarterly projections, acquisition targets, all the metrics that had once excited him but now felt like chains binding him to a desk that might as well have been a prison. His smartphone buzzed insistently with messages from his ex-wife, his estranged daughter, and various business associates. But he ignored them all. Communication had become purely transactional for Alistair. Every conversation was about what someone wanted from him, what they needed, what they expected him to deliver. The genuine human connections that had once sustained him had withered away years ago, casualties of his relentless pursuit of financial supremacy. He couldn't remember the last time someone had simply asked how he was feeling without an agenda lurking behind the question. The building's state-of-the-art climate control system hummed quietly, maintaining the perfect temperature and humidity levels that his executive team had determined would maximize productivity. But comfort, Alistair had learned, was a poor substitute for contentment. He thought about his penthouse apartment 30 floors above, equally pristine and equally empty, where he would spend another solitary evening with nothing but the glow of financial news channels for company. The irony wasn't lost on him that in a city of 8 million people, he had managed to construct a life of almost complete solitude. Outside, the afternoon storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened up, sending sheets of rain against the reinforced glass. The weather matched his mood, grey, turbulent, and promising nothing but more of the same. He had built Blackwood Industries from nothing, transforming a small investment firm inherited from his father into a global powerhouse that touched everything from renewable energy to artificial intelligence. But somewhere along the way, in the endless pursuit of the next deal, the next acquisition, the next breakthrough that would cement his legacy, he had lost track of why any of it mattered. His reflection stared back at him from the rain-streaked window, a lean man with silver hair and eyes that had once sparkled with ambition, but now carried only the weight of accumulated regrets. He thought about his daughter Sarah, now 25 and living in Seattle, who had stopped returning his calls after their last argument about her frivolous career in social work. She had accused him of caring more about his quarterly earnings than her happiness, and the worst part was that she might have been right. The distance between them wasn't measured in miles, but in a fundamental misunderstanding of what constituted a life worth living. The financial markets had closed an hour ago, but Alistair's day was far from over. A video conference with his Tokyo office was scheduled for 8 p.m., followed by calls with London and Dubai. The sun never set on Blackwood Industries, which meant the sun never set on his obligations either. He had become a prisoner of his own success, trapped in a cycle of endless responsibility to shareholders, employees, and a bottom line that demanded constant attention. As he turned back to his desk, preparing for another evening of isolation disguised as productivity, Alistair had no way of knowing that his carefully constructed world was about to be shattered by forces far beyond his control, and that salvation would come from the most unexpected source imaginable. Chapter 3. When Worlds Collide. The first alarm pierced through the building's ambient silence at 6:47 p.m., a sharp electronic wail that cut through Alistair's concentration like a blade. He looked up from his laptop, momentarily confused, as the sound grew louder and more insistent. The building's state-of-the-art fire suppression system should have handled any minor incident automatically, but the persistence of the alarm suggested something far more serious was unfolding. Within minutes, the smell hit him, acrid smoke creeping under his office door, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of burning plastic and electrical components. Alistair's assistant had long since departed, leaving him alone on the executive floor, and his first instinct was to head for the private elevator that connected directly to the parking garage. But as he approached the elevator bank, emergency lights began flashing red, and the displays showed out of service in stark, unforgiving letters. 23 floors below, Leo was hunched over his computer when the breaking news alert popped up on his screen. Massive fire engulfs Blackwood Tower in Midtown Manhattan. The word sent a chill down his spine, not because he knew anyone in the building, but because he recognized it immediately. The same glass monolith he'd been using as a landmark for his drone flights, testing Icarus's navigation systems around its imposing structure just last week. The live news feed showed flames licking at windows on multiple floors, with thick black smoke billowing into the grey autumn sky. Fire trucks surrounded the building's base like toys, their ladders extended but falling woefully short of the upper floors where the most intense flames were visible. The reporter's voice crackled with urgency as she explained that evacuation efforts were focused on the lower floors, but several people remained trapped above the reach of conventional rescue equipment. Leo's hands moved instinctively to his drone controller as he watched the coverage, his mind already calculating flight paths and wind patterns. The storm that had been brewing all afternoon was now in full force, with gusting winds that would make flying treacherous, even for an experienced pilot. But something about the scene on his screen, the desperate urgency of the firefighters, the growing intensity of the flames, triggered a response in him that bypassed rational thought and connected directly to his core sense of right and wrong. Meanwhile, Alistair found himself trapped in his office as smoke began seeping through the ventilation system despite the building's advanced filtration. The stairwells were inaccessible, filled with choking smoke and debris from the floors below, where the fire had apparently started in the building's electrical systems. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from emergency services, his security team, and news outlets, but the cellular towers in the area were overwhelmed, making communication sporadic at best. The irony was bitter and immediate. All his wealth, all his power, all the technology at his disposal, and he was as helpless as any ordinary person facing the fundamental force of fire. The flames were climbing steadily, consuming everything in their path, with an appetite that seemed almost personal. Through his smoke-stained windows, he could see the ant-like figures of emergency responders far below, their efforts valiant but ultimately insufficient to reach him. Leo watched the coverage with growing intensity, his programmer's mind automatically analyzing the problem like a complex algorithm that needed solving. The building's height, the wind conditions, the smoke density, the location of the trapped individuals, all variables in an equation that conventional rescue methods couldn't solve. But as he stared at Icarus sitting silently on his desk, an impossible idea began to form. The drone's payload capacity was limited, its flight time constrained, and the weather conditions were far from ideal. Yet something in the coverage, a glimpse of a figure silhouetted against the flames in an upper-floor window, made the decision for him. His mother's voice called from downstairs again, asking about dinner, but Leo was already moving with purpose that surprised him. His hands flew across the keyboard, modifying Icarus's programming with the urgency of someone who had suddenly found their true purpose. The theoretical algorithms he'd been perfecting for months were about to face their ultimate test, not in the controlled environment of his bedroom, but in the chaotic life-or-death reality of a Manhattan inferno. Chapter 4. Flight Against Fire. The modifications to Icarus's programming took Leo exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes during which he watched the news coverage with one eye, while his hands moved across the keyboard with a precision born of absolute necessity. He stripped away every non-essential function, every bit of code that wasn't critical to the mission forming in his mind. The drone's AI needed to be lean, responsive, and capable of making split-second decisions in an environment no programmer had ever anticipated. "Mom, I have to go!" Leo shouted as he grabbed Icarus and his controller, racing toward the subway station 6 blocks from his house. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was rushing toward the very chaos that most people were fleeing from. But the image of that trapped figure in the tower window had burned itself into his consciousness. During the 30-minute subway ride into Manhattan, he continued programming on his laptop, refining the autonomous navigation protocols that would allow Icarus to operate in near-zero visibility conditions. The scene around Blackwood Tower was chaos incarnate. Fire trucks, ambulances, police barriers, and hundreds of onlookers held back by yellow tape. The building rose like a burning spear into the storm-darkened sky, with flames now visible on at least 8 floors. Leo pushed through the crowd until he reached the police perimeter, where a fire chief was coordinating rescue efforts with grim efficiency. "Sir, I have a drone that might be able to reach the upper floors," Leo announced, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent uncertainty. The fire chief, a weathered man named Captain Rodriguez, looked down at the teenager with obvious skepticism. "Kid, this isn't the time for games. We've got professional equipment and trained pilots." "With respect, sir, your equipment can't reach floor 23, Leo replied, pointing upward. "My drone is small enough to navigate through the smoke, and I've programmed it specifically for urban obstacle avoidance." He held up Icarus, its modest size suddenly feeling inadequate for the task ahead. "I know it doesn't look like much, but it's carrying a carbon fiber cable that could support someone's weight." Captain Rodriguez studied the boy's face, seeing something in his eyes that transcended age, a quiet confidence that spoke of genuine expertise rather than teenage bravado. The conventional wisdom said no, said this was too dangerous, said a 14-year-old with a toy couldn't accomplish what professional rescue teams with million-dollar equipment couldn't. But conventional wisdom hadn't accounted for the unique combination of desperation, innovation, and pure human determination standing before him. 23 floors above, Alistair had given up hope. The smoke was thickening, making each breath a conscious effort, and the heat was becoming unbearable even with his office door sealed. He had used his tie to cover his nose and mouth, but it provided little protection against the acrid fumes that burned his lungs. Through the chaos of his thoughts, he found himself thinking not about his business empire or his financial legacy, but about Sarah, about all the conversations they'd never had, all the moments he'd sacrificed on the altar of professional success. Leo launched Icarus from the building's plaza level, the drone's motors whining against the wind and rain as it began its ascent. Through his controller's screen, he could see the building's facade rushing past, windows reflecting the orange glow of flames and the strobing lights of emergency vehicles below. The smoke created a disorienting maze of visibility, sometimes clear enough to see for 50 feet, sometimes so thick that the drone's cameras showed nothing but grey static. As Icarus climbed higher, Leo felt the weight of every decision he'd made in programming its behavior. The drone's AI was essentially flying blind, using a combination of GPS coordinates, building schematics he'd downloaded from the city planning office, and real-time sensor data to navigate toward the executive floors. His hands were steady on the controller, but his heart was racing as he watched the battery indicator slowly decrease. He would have one chance at this, maybe 2 if he was lucky. At floor 23, Icarus's thermal sensors detected a heat signature near the northeast corner, exactly where the news reports had indicated someone was trapped. Leo guided the drone toward the window, its small frame bucking against the wind gusts that threatened to slam it into the building's facade. Through the smoke-obscured camera feed, he could barely make out a human figure pressed against the glass, one hand visible as it desperately tried to signal for help. Inside his office, Alistair heard the impossible sound of rotors cutting through the storm. At first, he thought it was a helicopter, but the noise was too small, too precise. When he looked toward his window, he saw something that defied all logic. A small drone hovering just outside, somehow maintaining perfect position despite the wind and chaos surrounding them. For a moment, he wondered if the smoke inhalation was causing hallucinations, but the tiny aircraft was undeniably real, and it was carrying something that looked like a cable. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between human ingenuity and digital precision. Leo programmed Icarus to deploy the ultra-thin carbon fiber line, watching through the camera feed as Alistair understood what was happening and began securing the cable around his waist with the desperation of a man who had run out of alternatives. The drone's motors strained against the additional weight, but the modifications Leo had made held firm, the machine maintaining its position with mechanical determination that mirrored its operator's human resolve. As emergency crews on the ground coordinated the final phase of the rescue, Leo felt something shift inside himself, not just pride in his technical achievement, but a profound understanding that technology wasn't about the machines themselves, but about the human connections they could create and the lives they could touch. Watching Alistair slowly descend that thin lifeline, guided by a device born from a teenager's lonely nights and boundless imagination, Leo realized that he had found something more valuable than code or circuits. He had found his purpose.